Welcome to this very special event at Superbooth 2022. Well, I feel like a little child sitting underneath its heroes. Hi, Tom Oberheim. We have via Zoom. On my left is Marcus Ryle, Dave Smith. Yay! Please. So these three gentlemen brought out so many signature sound synthesizers and instruments. It's a little bit overwhelming for me, little boy. So, yes, Marcus Ryle, you were starting with Oberheim in the 80s, I think. But you also were a developer for other big brands like Alesis and Line 6.
That's right.
And about Dave Smith and Tom, we can say the giants of polyphonic, or I'm too pathetic. Sorry for that. But you two started with MIDI in 1982 or 1981.
Well, 1981, Dave and I flew to Japan together for the first of what became a MIDI.
Yeah, at that time, a revolution in the music making world, making many things easier. The music production changed completely, and leaving the message only with the question, does this plug to MIDI in or to MIDI out? So I was thinking where to start, because there were so many instruments that came out, and I remember a meeting at NAMM show. It was the beginning, the early 2000s. I mean, we met many times at NAMM show and Musikmesse. You came up with the Evolver, a little hybrid analog-digital desktop, and
yes,
this was analog synthesizers were little TB303 clones at that time, I think. And I was asking you, what was the idea behind it? And you said, well, I was experimenting with little circuitry, and I thought, there's maybe something possible.
Well, basically, I had been working on software synthesizers in the mid-90s, and I decided I didn't like them so much. So I decided it was time to build hardware again, and I started from scratch. I had first hardware design in 15 years, and the idea of the Evolver was to combine analog filters and analog oscillators with digital oscillators and other digital circuitry, and have them tightly coupled to come up with a kind of a new signal flow. For example, having tune feedback, which is like a physical modeling idea, but have it go through an analog filter. Mm-hmm. So it was all about new sounds and new ideas, and I had no plans for the future. It was just seemed like a good idea to make a new instrument, and here we are 20 years later with 20 instruments in between.
Yeah, but my question was, I was lucky to take one of the first Evolvers from NAMM to Germany, and sitting on the plane I was going like, what did he exactly mean with something? So today, this is something completely different. We can see there were some more Evolvers following, the Mofo, Prophets. Sequential was back. Like we have the original name, Oberheim is back these days. Yeah, it's a lot, and I would like to ask you what little something we have now. You're collaborating, you three guys are collaborating with Oberheim now.
Yes, we are.
And there is the new product, it's the OBX8.
Yes, and it'd be better for Marcus and Tom to talk about it in the details, but of course we did the OB6 6 years ago, and that idea was a new spin on the Oberheim sound. This time, especially after doing the Prophet 5 a year and a half ago, we said, well, maybe we should go back and do the original Oberheim. And it was a really fun project, and Marcus and Tom would be better to talk about how we did that and what we did and what it is, because this is really awesome.
I heard it in the presentation this day, and it's really fat, yes.
It's the real
Sounds
thing.
like in the 80s.
Yeah.
So what was your part of
my part?
this?
I guess I'm a real lucky guy because being able to work with Dave and Tom is a real treat. Dave, maybe like some of you, I got into synthesizers at a very young age. And at 16 years old, I snuck into the NAMM show in 1978 and saw Dave introducing the Prophet 5. And that was, I knew at that moment that this was going to be quite a remarkable synthesizer and change the world. And I teased Dave because he doesn't remember that. I don't really expect he'd remember one of the thousands of people that came by his booth at that time. But I was very fortunate that not long after, I got to meet Tom Oberheim in early 1980, and he brought an OBX down to university I was at, and I was 19 years old, and he offered me a job designing synthesizers. And so from 1980 to 85, I had the good fortune of being able to work with Tom from the that would be, the OBX had already shipped. We worked on the OBXA together, DSX, DMX, OB8, Expander, Matrix 12, and the like from 80 to 85. And, I think all of us here today is really a testament to what Tom created and how endearing and powerful the sounds of these synths were. And so to have the opportunity to work with Tom and with Dave and all the experience he and his team brings so that we could bring that back today has been really quite a thrill.
So my question to Tom would be, the OBX8, is it bringing up the old sound, like from the SEM modules to the OBX8 and OBXA to all the well-known machines from that time? How do you bring this together?
Well, the Tom Oberheim world of polyphonic synthesizers, it didn't start with a big splash like Dave and the Prophet 5. It was a slow process in a way. The first time I ever heard a polyphonic synthesizer sound was in 1972, when at that point in time I was an art dealer in the Los Angeles area. I think I was the first art dealer west of the Mississippi, and I made a little kit for the 2600 that allowed to play two pitches on our 2600. In those days, I did some concerts in experimental electronic music with a good friend of mine, and for one of the concerts, I set up two 2600s with both of them having the two-note possibility, and my friend figured out how to play it. It's such a crude setup, and it was such a great sound that stuck in my head. In those days, I was building pedals. I had the first phase shift on the market, the first ring modulator from performing musician, and that was kind of my business. But I decided to make a little synthesizer module, and that became the SEM. And then in 1975, I got out of the pedal business, and I threw together 4 SEMs and a scanning keyboard that I had licensed from EMU Systems, and I had a polyphonic synthesizer, crude but sounded great, and I showed it at the NAMM show in Chicago in June of 1975, and all of a sudden Oberheim Electronics was on the map. and that lasted for about 2.5 years, and it was a lot of fun, and a lot of great musicians bought it, but it was a very crude machine because at one time with the four voice you only had about 80 knobs and 30 or 40 switches. You had to manually switch to get another sound. In this winter of 1978, we all were at the Winter NAMM show. In those days, it was the small part of the small show of NAMM, and there were, down in the basement at the Digiland Hotel was this new company, Sequential Circuits. And I remember I took a couple of my employees that were involved in synthesizers to that show, and we went down in the basement, we saw it and said, "Oh, it's just a polyphonic mini mug, haha." Well, by the end of 1978, the Prophet 5 was going crazy, and we were not selling many of our crude, not programmable monsters. And so we either had to do something or close the doors. So my engineer at the time, Jim Cooper, and I put our heads together. I think it was in November of '78, and we created, shall we say, the OBX, and we showed it then at the NAMM show in Atlanta in June of '79. And with every expectation, if the OBX didn't do well, we'd be out of business when we went back to LA. And by noon on the first day of the show, we had enough sales that we knew we were still in business. So that was how the OBX started. The next
It was
stage
my fault.
It's all Dave's fault.
Yeah, you just.
Well, I think we looked around. Without Dave, we'd still be playing B3 Hammonds or something. Anyway, so the next thing that happened in those days, I had met Doug Curtis, who became famous making the Curtis chips, and I was his first actual customer. But by 1978, 79, he had a full chipset. So the next thing we did was convert to Curtis chips in 81, and that was the OBX-A. And it was a better machine in a lot of ways. Technically, it was more reliable. It had, I'd say, a slightly different sound, but Doug and I had a lot of discussions, and so I think the OBX-A, it sounded a little different, and it was more reliable and whatever, but it was an outgrowth in a sense of the OBX, even though the circuitry was different. And then as we learned more and about designing these things, a couple of years later, we did the OB8, and there are a lot of those machines up. They've done well, and that was a fun time.
Yes, you just said we created the creation of the OBX, and now we have the OBX-8, and I think, yeah, the question is, what is the intention? Is it a recreation?
Well,
Yes.
when I started talking to Dave and Marcus about this machine we now call the OBX-8, I asked, could I take a look at the schematics, and they sent it, because at that point it was being designed within Sequential completely, and I looked at it and I said, well, wow, this is an OBX, and this is an OBX-A, and this is an OB8. It's not, there's no digital simulation of the oscillators or the filter or any of that. If you take out an SCM schematic and you look at the circuitry, in the OBX8, the SCM part, it's the SCM. It's the I mean, it's every resistor, capacitor, temperature compensating resistor, and all the things we did with analog is there. And then you look, and the next one, it's Curtis filter for the other two, etc. It's not something dreamed up by some softwares working with Shark or whatever. It's the real thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I think the key. I mean, it's understandable that some people first looking at this will think it's an emulation or it's some tribute to the original, but this is, it's funny, some people have asked how long did it take to develop this? I say, well, it started in 1978 because the schematics and the work that Tom did starting from back then, from being inspired and threatened by Dave, that's where the origin is. So as Tom says, you can look at the schematics and see, well, here's exactly what it should be if you want it to sound like an OBX. So it's not an accident that we can sound like an OBX, an OBXA, and OB8, because that is the audio circuitry. And taking great care to ensure it's not just the design, exactly the levels that are going from the oscillators to the filters, exactly how, the shapes of modulation, all of these things need to be exactly like the original. And it's a lot easier to do that when you have people around that were around when the originals happened. So,
actually, I'd like to say, after 50 years, I'm a pretty good synth designer, but there is no way we could have designed this without Tom and Marcus involved. It just would not have been possible. There was just too many little things in there. Well, you having the original source code from back then, I mean, it's
how many of you had to try to read data off 5 1/4 inch floppies lately? That was part of my job.
I can't believe you kept that
But we
stuff.
did it.
So it's the real thing. Original factory presets for all 4 instruments, also the OBSX that people don't know that much about. And we can, if you have a cassette from your instruments way back, you could load it in and have your presets back.
Yeah, we literally, we can read the original factory cassette data and bit for bit map them to the parameters on the OBX8, and it's the real thing.
Well, this is about resources and data, but I think the recreation of something analog is a hard task when you try to match the original sound today, because you don't have the original components from that time.
But
we're very fortunate that we do. Yeah.
We do, actually. The 3320s, the filter, is being made by On-Chip Systems, which is Doug Curtis's company. I mean, that's one of the reasons I redid the Prophet 5 when I did is, they have the 3340 VCOs. They have the 3320 VCFs. I can do it again. So it's the same thing here. I don't know that we would have tried to do this if we couldn't get the authentic, original Curtis chips.
Yeah, it's the original. It's not. I mean, there are some companies that are trying to make clones of these chips and things like that, but these are Curtis chips. This is Doug Curtis's original design. Doug Curtis was a huge part of Oberheim synths and many synths. He's someone that some of you may not have heard of. He sadly passed away far too young, but he was a brilliant, brilliant engineer and a real passionate synthesizer designer himself. And so, if you want it to sound like Curtis filters, you put in Curtis filters.
It's like cheating.
Yeah, okay, ensuring that the sound will match the original, yeah. But there is much more built in. I think there are more characteristics of filters. It's not only the Oberheim sound. And I read something about a hidden page 2.
Yeah, page 2, at Oberheim, when we got to the OB8, it was kind of the early days of discovering how you could use microprocessors to do more fun stuff in controlling analog. It just, I mean, there's sometimes a lot of confusion of just what's analog and what's digital. What was such a breakthrough in what Dave did with the Prophet 5 and is the same concept all the way through to here is the notion of digitally controlled analog, having microprocessors controlling the analog portion. And once you're controlling digitally, with the OB8, we discovered, well, what if we made the LFOs in software? What if the portamento was in software? And once those were in software, because those aren't the audio signals, those are control signals, we came up with all kinds of ideas of new features. Well, let's do exponential portamento and bend portamento, and let's have delayed modulation and so on. But we had this same front panel, and back then you couldn't very easily throw a display or things like that onto a product. No one had a computer to do a computer editor, so there wasn't MIDI yet. So the answer was page 2. So if any of you have played an original OB8, there was a button. It was actually a dual function button. You had to double click it. I think it's before we even knew what double click was, right? We weren't even using mice back then. But you double clicked the page 2 button, and the knobs and buttons had a secondary function. And in the first OB8s, those secondary functions weren't even screened on the panel. So if you didn't have an owner's manual, it was like a secret code, the secret handshake. Only the really cool synthesis knew all the hidden features of an OB8. Eventually, we screened it on there. But in order for this to properly make all the sounds of the OB8, we had to implement all of the page 2 features. But unlike the OB8, we actually could put a display here. So you actually can see what all the parameters are. And that gave us the opportunity to add a bunch of additional features as well to further enhance what's possible on the OBX8.
Yeah, one of the real cool features we did is we added all the SEM filter modes. So the OBX was only 2-pole low pass, but on the OBX8 you have band pass and high pass and notch. So we snuck a few extra things into page 2 to give it, so this is actually an SEM also in some ways. I can go on and on, but it's boring to list features, so we won't do that now. But
I think it's all inspired from those Oberheim origins. I mean, the filter that Tom put into the SEM and having all those modes, that 2-pole state variable filter, that's such an iconic sound. So although, as Dave said, we didn't actually have those in the OBs, but the OBX filter was that same filter, just without giving you the choice of those other modes. So we thought, well, why not? Let's put it in.
Well, I like it very much because it is very expressive, this filter, with the possibility to sweep between the characteristics. That's great. With a polyphonic, wow. Well, now we have an idea of the differences between the originals and the new one. There was one issue with the synthesizers of the 80s. It was pitch stability. What about today?
Who wants to go?
well,
I'll take that one. Oh,
okay.
Go ahead, Dave.
No,
Well, I was just going to say that when I started, as I mentioned earlier, the first actual synthesizer type thing I designed or I created, because I didn't design all of it, I had help, was the SEM. And at that point in time, I got to know Dave Rossum of EMU Systems, and we had some discussions about that. And he had a solution for pitch stability. It involved classic math, electronic math, but suffice it to say that with all the 4-voice, 8-voice, OBX machines around, and as well as SEMs that were sold by themselves, and even before the Doug Curtis VCO that solved that problem, it's never been a problem in my life. I've had this question many times, and one of my reps told me that when I think it was the Beach Boys had a big Oberheim 8 voice, and I met their technician, and I said, well, do you have any problem with this, with the 8 voice? No, I just take it out of the box and put it on the stand and turn it on, and it takes a little bit of time to warm up, and it's ready to go. So I think that's, I won't say a myth, but I think that was something that was solved pretty early.
Well, I think what's also nice, Tom, is, back then, the evolution of tuning, obviously it was a new thing with polyphonic synthesizers, that you didn't just have 2 or 3 oscillators like on a Mini Moog or an Odyssey. Now you've got times however many voices you have. So I think the Prophet 5 was the first to have an auto-tune routine. In the OBX and XA, there was an auto-tune. It only tuned on 1 note. So if your tracking inside was not calibrated properly, you still could get pretty far out of tune. That was more a problem of calibration than temperature. But something Dave and his team have incorporated in the newer products, which is also here, which is so great, is there's actually a temperature sensor in the synthesizer, and when you calibrate, it knows based on what temperature you're at, it remembers what the right calibrations are. So as your synthesizer heats up or cools down, it's compensating for that. So still pure, perfect analog oscillators, but now with a lot more stability in tuning.
So I see the OBX8 has the design of the OBX, so the gray panel, and I think the OBX is the first instrument and there were some very other famous instruments following, like the OBXA, Expander, Matrix. They had the black-blue line interface, a user interface. So my question would be, what is the next little something?
Wow.
More to come.
Well,
Wait and see.
when we figure it out, you'll be the last to know.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think there is not more to say. Tom Oberheim, Dave Smith, Marcus Fry, thank you so much. You are heroes. Thank you.